Have you ever felt that constant pressure, you know, to have all the answers, to
Yeah.
be absolutely certain about everything?
Oh, definitely.
And then you just find yourself more anxious or conflicted, maybe even stuck.
Yeah.
In our world today, I mean, we're just bombarded with information, right?
Hmm.
And it's often contradictory.
Absolutely.
And
Nonsense.
that quest for the definitive truth, the one right answer,
Yeah.
can just feel exhausting. You know that feeling? That internal tug of war where you feel like you have to pick a side?
Or you must know the absolute right answer. Yeah. To everything complex.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Well, for this deep dive, we're going to explore something, an ancient remedy, you could say, for this very modern problem.
Mm.
Today, we're diving into the really fascinating, often mysterious world of Pyrrho of Elais. He was an ancient Greek philosopher whose ideas about radical skepticism offer, well, a surprising pathway to inner peace.
It's quite profound, isn't it?
It really is. A way of thinking that still resonates, I think, millennia later.
Indeed. And our sources for today, they give us this rare, intriguing glimpse into a figure who really challenged the very foundations of knowledge and belief back in his time.
Right.
And he left a legacy that, resonates profoundly with our own quest for clarity, for calm, amidst all this noise today.
So we'll be uncovering his unique life, which is pretty enigmatic.
Very much so.
His groundbreaking philosophical foundations, and crucially, how his approach wasn't just intellectual. It was designed as a practical guide for, well, a tranquil life.
That's the key, I think, the practical application.
Our mission, then, is to unpack these core concepts of Pyrrhon's skepticism and discover how his pursuit of ataraxia, that's a state of unshakable tranquility,
Hmm.
how that might just offer a fresh perspective, maybe even a counterintuitive one, on how you navigate the complexities of your own information-rich world.
And maybe find more peace within it.
Exactly. So what was this radical approach, and how can it possibly apply to us today? Let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
Okay, so to really get his philosophy, we first need to understand the man himself.
Right, right. Context is key.
When we talk about ancient philosophers, some names just pop up. Plato, Aristotle, we know them.
Household names, almost.
But then there are these other figures, these enigmatic ones, almost whispered about from antiquity, who just challenge everything we think we know. Pyrrho of Elais. He definitely seems to fit that bill, doesn't he?
Oh, absolutely. He truly is one of the most, maybe the most enigmatic figures in ancient Greek philosophy.
Okay.
Yeah. Born around 360 BCE in Elis, that's in modern-day Greece. But the details of his life, they're remarkably limited.
Unlike Plato or Aristotle, then.
Exactly. We don't have these extensive dialogues or treatises written by him or, meticulous historical chronicles of his day-to-day. The scarcity of sources makes getting a definitive, detailed biography incredibly difficult.
So we're basically piecing together fragments.
We really are, like putting together a mosaic with lots of missing pieces. But I think this very mystery surrounding him actually kind of lends itself to his philosophy.
Yeah. How so?
Well, his philosophy embraces the unknown,
Yeah.
the limits of our knowledge.
Ah, okay. So we're piecing together a puzzle with significant missing pieces. That definitely adds to the intrigue, actually.
It does.
And maybe makes his ideas even more compelling, given how much we don't know for sure about his life.
Precisely. But what we do know, mostly from later accounts, references from other philosophers like his student Timon of Phlius,
Mm-hmm.
it places his life right at the very beginning of the Hellenistic period. And this wasn't just any random time. It was a period, an immense intellectual upheaval, huge transformation.
Right, the old order changing.
Think about it. The classical era of the city-states, the philosophical certainties of Plato and Aristotle, that was all giving way to this new, vast, sort of globalized world forged by Alexander the Great's conquests.
Wow.
So the old certainties were being challenged, new ideas were bubbling up everywhere. It was fertile ground for radical new ways of thinking.
So that broader historical context, the Hellenistic era, must have profoundly shaped his thinking then. Alexander the Great's vast empire. That's a huge shift, not just political, but intellectual, too.
Absolutely. Alexander's Eastern campaigns, they weren't just about politics and military might. They ignited this massive interaction of different cultures, ideas, philosophies across this huge area from Greece all the way to India.
That's incredible to imagine.
Yeah. Imagine the intellectual ferment, the clash and blend of worldviews, Greek thought bumping up against Persian, Egyptian, and particularly Indian traditions.
Hmm.
This unprecedented situation, it profoundly influenced Pyrrhon's intellectual world. It exposed him to perspectives that were just wildly different from the established Greek traditions he grew up with.
And this is where it gets really fascinating. I read he had direct contact with Indian philosophy during these travels. That feels like such a pivotal moment.
Yes, that's a crucial point. And it's
Yeah.
one of the few biographical details that, well, many scholars agree had a significant impact. A real turning point in Pyrrhon's life was indeed his contact with Indian philosophy, particularly the gymnosophists. They were a group of ancient Indian ascetic philosophers.
Oh, wait, the naked philosophy.
Exactly, during these Eastern expeditions. And this interaction, specifically the striking similarities he saw with certain strands of Indian skepticism and maybe Buddhist thought,
Such as?
well, ideas about detachment from worldly desires, letting go of fixed views about reality, concepts like the Buddhist idea of dukkha, suffering, which arises from clinging to fixed views and attachments.
Okay.
That seems to have resonated with Pyrrhon's own developing ideas about the distress caused by dogmatic certainty. And the Indian skeptical tradition, the Nastika, also questioned absolute knowable truth, advocating a similar suspension of judgment.
Wow.
So it wasn't just an observation for him. It was a profound cross-cultural philosophical exchange that really shaped his path. It pushed his skepticism into a more radical and, importantly, practical direction than it might have otherwise taken.
So moving beyond just intellectual games.
Exactly. Towards a way of life.
So he's traveling, absorbing all these diverse influences, but he also spent time back in Athens, the philosophical heartland. How did that work? Did he try to fit in, or did he keep his own distinct path?
He was certainly active in places like Athens, which was, the hub for philosophical debates then, just like it is in many ways now.
Sure.
But despite his travels, his exposure to Eastern thought, he was very much engaged with the philosophical currents of his own culture. And at the time, Athens was dominated by what we call dogmatic thought.
Platonism, Aristotelian.
Exactly. And when we say dogmatic here, it's not necessarily negative, like closed-minded. It's descriptive.
Okay.
It just means these were philosophies built on claims of definite, absolute knowledge, universal truths about reality. They believed they could establish these complete, undeniable systems through reason or observation, offering definitive answers.
And he just stood against all that. This one guy challenging the philosophical giants of his time, that takes some serious intellectual courage.
It really does, yes. He developed a radical skepticism in direct opposition to these dominant schools. And for Pyrrhon, this wasn't just some abstract position for debates.
Right, you said it was practical.
It manifested as a deeply personal life practice. It influenced everything he did, how he reacted. His philosophy was both a reaction against that prevailing dogmatic environment, the insistence on certainty, and, maybe paradoxically, an intellectual and personal refuge for him.
A refuge. How so?
He found peace not in finding definitive answers, but in the release from the need to find them. A peace that must have stood in stark contrast to the often agitated debates of his contemporaries battling over who had the truth.
Okay, so let's dig into that core philosophy.
Yeah.
When we hear skepticism today, it often just means general doubt, maybe even cynicism.
Oh, I distrust.
But Pyrrhon's approach sounds much deeper, more systematic than just questioning everything vaguely. Can you unpack that?
Indeed. Yeah, Pyrrhon is considered one of the earliest, most influential figures in skepticism's history. And his approach was anything but superficial or lazy. His philosophy goes way beyond just saying everything is doubtful or knowledge is impossible.
Yeah.
It's a deep, systematic understanding of skepticism within epistemology that's the theory of knowledge itself. How we get it, its limits, what counts as valid knowledge, can we even truly know anything?
So what was his fundamental belief about knowledge? What's the bedrock of his argument?
His core assumption, the foundation really, is that humans cannot truly know reality in a definite, absolute, clear way. We just lack the inherent means, he argued, to grasp the absolute truth of things as they really are, independent of us.
Independent of our perception or interpretation.
Exactly, or the limits of our own minds. This foundational belief underpins his whole opposition to dogmatic beliefs, to definitive judgments. He saw them as unwarranted claims of certainty about things that are ultimately unknowable. It's a huge challenge to the very idea that we can establish absolute, unshakable truth.
Why did he believe that? Why couldn't we achieve definite knowledge? What were the limitations he saw in us?
Well, according to Pyrrhon, We can access absolute knowledge through our perceptions, our senses, or even through reasoning. He argued these tools are either inherently misleading or they're just severely limited.
Okay, like our senses.
Yeah, think about our senses. They're subjective, often contradictory. What one person sees or hears might be totally different for someone else.
Or even for the same person at a different time.
Right. A stick looks bent in water, but it's straight. Honey tastes sweet to me, but maybe bitter to you if you're ill. This variability just makes it impossible to claim an absolute truth based purely on sensory experience.
Makes sense?
And furthermore, and this is absolutely central to his method, he argued that for pretty much any argument, you can almost always find equally strong evidence, equally compelling reasons, both for it and against it.
This is the equal strength idea?
Yeah, exactly. Isosthenia, this balance of opposing arguments. Because of this isosthenia, it becomes impossible to logically arrive at a definite conclusion. If both sides have equally good points, how can you rationally say one is definitively right?
Right, without just asserting it.
Precisely. And this dilemma for Pyrrho didn't lead to despair. It led to a specific, and he thought, liberating philosophical response: suspending judgment.
Okay, here's where it gets really transformative. He developed this specific practice, this concept called epoche. What exactly is that? How does it work?
Epoche is the practice of consciously, deliberately refusing to make a definite judgment on any matter where you find that isosthenia, that equal strength of arguments.
So you see the balance and just stop.
You stop asserting a truth claim, but crucially, it's not ignorance or apathy or just being lazy intellectually.
Okay, that's important.
It's not being indecisive. It's a deliberate, methodical, conscious, philosophical position, an active, reasoned choice to withhold assent, rather than just passively failing to make up your mind.
Okay. You recognize neither side definitively wins, so you refrain from dogmatically asserting one as true.
Exactly.
So what's the benefit? For many of us, letting go of certainty feels like losing control, It feels like it leads to indecision. But for Pyrrho, it led somewhere else entirely.
Yeah, and this is the core of his insight and why it's so relevant now. Pyrrho argued that this state of suspending judgment would free the mind from what he saw as the main source of dogmatic errors, and more importantly, psychological distress.
How so?
Think about it. If you're constantly trying to assert definite truths in a world where they're elusive, you're setting yourself up for contradiction, disappointment, mental struggle.
We crave certainty.
We do. And when the world doesn't provide it, or when our certainties get challenged, we suffer. We get anxious when we don't have all the answers, when we can't label something definitively good or bad with absolute conviction.
Or when we have to choose between two seemingly equal options.
Right. The burden of always having to be certain, of needing to definitively label everything is immense. So by refraining from absolute claims, by consciously practicing epoche, Pyrrho argued, you could achieve a calmer, more balanced state of mind.
It's about releasing that mental burden.
Yes, the burden of having to be certain. For Pyrrho, that was the root of so much anxiety and internal conflict.
So this idea of suspending judgment, it wasn't just about knowing the physical world. Did it apply elsewhere, like ethics, or understanding existence itself?
Oh, yes. It extended well beyond epistemology. His skepticism went right into metaphysics and ethics, too.
Okay, metaphysics first.
Metaphysically dealing with the fundamental nature of reality, he argued it's impossible to say anything definitive about the true nature of existence. Any claims about the essence, the ultimate nature, the fundamental structure of being, rejected.
Like grand theories about why things exist.
Exactly, or what their ultimate form is, whether there's a creator, an eternal substance, the true form of the universe. He'd say we just lack the means to know that definitively.
Okay. And ethics.
Yeah.
How does suspending judgment work there? Didn't that mean just doing whatever you want?
No, not quite. In ethics, Pyrrho believed that dogmatic moral norms unnecessarily disturbed people. If you cling rigidly to an absolute moral code, and life inevitably throws situations at you that challenge those absolutes or make them impossible to perfectly follow, it creates huge anxiety and internal conflict.
Right, the gray areas.
Exactly. Adhering to rigid, definite rules causes distress when faced with real-world complexities, where clear right or wrong might not apply, or where different cultures have totally different moral systems. So he advocated suspending judgment in moral matters, too.
But what did that mean in practice?
It didn't mean becoming immoral or abandoning action. It meant living according to appearances and custom-following societal norms for practical reasons to get along, but crucially without dogmatic conviction that those norms represented absolute truth.
Ah, okay. Follow the rules, but don't believe they're the ultimate cosmic law.
Kind of, yeah. This approach helped avoid the distress caused by moral dilemmas or the rigid, anxious adherence to potentially flawed or relative rules.
So it really sounds like Pyrrhon's philosophy wasn't just for academics. It was incredibly practical, almost like a manual for living. What was the ultimate goal of all this, the epiche, the skepticism?
Exactly. It was far more than theory. It was fundamentally a way of life, a means to achieve psychological relief, inner peace. His ultimate goal was reaching ataraxia.
Ataraxia.
Yeah, which translates beautifully as carefree, serenity, or an unaffected emotional state. It's that state where your mind isn't troubled, agitated, disturbed by external events or internal conflicts, just profound inner calm, unshaken, regardless of circumstances.
How does letting go of certainty lead to that kind of deep peace? It still feels a bit counterintuitive. We usually think certainty brings security, comfort.
That's the core insight, and it's so relevant today. Pyrrhon argued that most of our psychological suffering comes directly from dogmatic beliefs, from this insistent, almost desperate need for definite knowledge, absolute truths. Think about it. We constantly feel anxiety and conflict because we want to grasp absolute truths about reality, morality, the future, ourselves. We crave certainty. And when the world doesn't give it, which it often doesn't, we suffer.
You get anxious when we don't have all the answers.
Exactly. Or when we can't definitively label something good or bad, right or wrong. The burden of needing to be right, to know for sure, it's huge.
Okay, I see that.
So if a person accepts that these absolute truths might just not be reachable and consistently practices suspending judgment about them, embraces epiche, then, Pyrrhon says, they can achieve profound mental serenity. Ataraxia.
It frees you from that internal discord.
Yes. From the constant struggle to reconcile contradictory beliefs or force a conclusion where maybe none can be found, imagine the relief. It allows for a more balanced, flexible attitude towards the world, reacting to things as they appear, not through the rigid, often anxiety-filled lens of dogmatic interpretation.
Are there stories about him demonstrating this?
There are anecdotes, yeah, probably embellished over time, but they tell of Pyrrhon showing extreme detachment, remaining totally unfazed in dangerous situations, walking calmly when others panicked,
Wow.
because he'd suspended judgment on whether the situation was inherently good or bad. Now, likely apocryphal, but it illustrates the dedication to this ideal of tranquility.
So ataraxia wasn't just a nice side effect, it was the whole point.
Absolutely. It stands as both an ethical and psychological principle right at the core of Pyrrhon's philosophy.
The goal of philosophy itself.
For him, yes. This state of calmness was the true aim, the ultimate goal of all intellectual effort. Not just accumulating knowledge or winning debates, but using intellectual tools to achieve inner peace, well-being.
So the epistemology, the skepticism about knowledge.
It serves this deeper psychological and ethical purpose. It allows you to escape unnecessary mental contradictions and the anxieties they bring. And this is where that contact with Eastern philosophies, which also sought liberation from suffering through detachment, seems to have really clicked for him.
So what does this mean for us today? It really does sound like a form of ancient therapy. A blueprint for mental well-being in our chaotic, information-saturated world.
You hit it, exactly.
I mean, think about the anxiety of choosing between two news sources that say opposite things.
Yeah.
Or the stress of feeling you must have a definitive opinion on every complex issue thrown at you.
Right. From this perspective, Pyrrhon's philosophy really functions as a kind of mental health philosophy, even in a very contemporary sense. Releasing that obsession with definite knowledge, embracing skepticism not as cynicism, but as a tool for liberation, and consciously accepting the uncertainty it brings, that creates an environment for profound serenity in the mind. Think about modern information overload. Constant pressure to form opinions, take sides, declare certainty. Pyrrhon would say the relief from that very mental burden, the liberation from needing to be right, is the peace.
It's the tranquility you feel when you genuinely accept maybe not everything has a definitive answer.
And that you don't have to commit to one. For Pyrrhon, philosophy wasn't just abstract. It was a practical tool for addressing life's problems and achieving personal tranquility amidst the inherent unknowability of the world. A direct path to a more peaceful, less burdened existence.
Okay, so if ataraxia is the goal, how did he actually practice suspending judgment systematically? Can't have just been saying, I don't know all the time. That seems too simple.
No, it was much more sophisticated, and this is where his intellectual rigor really comes through. The foundation of his skepticism wasn't just general doubt or suspending judgment randomly. It involved methodically balancing, giving equal weight to different viewpoints.
Okay.
This rigorous method is based on that principle we mentioned, isosthenia.
Meaning equal strength.
Exactly, equal strength or equal power. It's recognizing that for any given proposition or argument, an equally strong, equally compelling counterproposition can usually be advanced, making a definitive choice impossible without just asserting it.
So if he looked at an argument and then its counter-argument, he'd basically say, okay, these are equally valid, equally weighty, like a perfectly balanced scale.
That's an excellent analogy, the perfectly balanced scale. Pyrrho contended that when you examine any issue, the opposing arguments hold equal weight. Consequently, he refused to definitively commit to one view over another.
Okay.
This methodological stance aimed to establish a logical balance between all the arguments presented. He wasn't dismissing them, he was affirming their inherent balance and the lack of a definitive reason to prefer one.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Consider a classic philosophical question. Is reality fundamentally one thing or is it many things? Monism versus pluralism. For Pyrrho, the arguments for both could be presented with such compelling force that no purely rational basis remained for choosing one over the other definitively.
So you lay out the pros and cons for both.
Systematically. The supporting evidence, the counter-evidence, the perceived truths, they're equally plausible alternatives, and then conclude that neither holds a clear, logical, or experiential advantage.
Okay. And doing that consistently.
In this process, Pyrrho would consistently move back and forth between the alternative views, recognizing their symmetrical strengths. He believed this deliberate exercise would free the mind from dogmatic rigidity, from preconceived notions.
It's like a mental workout.
It really is. Actively considering a position, then actively considering its opposite, seeing the strengths in both without feeling that pressure to choose. This disciplined back and forth was a huge innovation epistemologically, a radical departure.
A liberation from intellectual tyranny, you said.
Yeah, that captures it well.
How was it so different from what came before? From Plato or Aristotle building their grand systems?
That's the crucial distinction, because previous philosophers were mostly trying to arrive at definite knowledge. To build comprehensive systems based on a particular understanding of reality. Their goal was the ultimate truth, a dogmatic framework with definitive answers. Pyrrho, though, questioned the whole endeavor. He showed, through isosthenia, that such certainty might just not be attainable, or at least our human minds aren't equipped to reach it. So his method introduced this radical critique, not just offering a different answer, but questioning the very possibility of the answer.
He wasn't saying, here's the new truth.
No, he was saying, can we truly know any truth definitively? It was a profound shift in the whole purpose of philosophy.
And this method, isosthenia, that was his personal practice too, not just theory.
Absolutely. It wasn't just for abstract debates. By consistently avoiding definite judgments, methodically balancing alternative views in deep philosophical discussions, and in daily life, he believed one could remain mentally and emotionally unshaken.
Because if you don't cling to one belief as absolute,
then you can't be devastated or distressed when it's challenged or seems proven false. This detachment from firm conviction, born from rigorously applying isosthenia, was the practical path to ataraxia. The mental exercise yielded the reward of inner peace.
it sounds like an incredibly powerful tool for composure, especially now. We're constantly hit with conflicting information, pressured to take a stance instantly.
It really does resonate, doesn't it?
So let's place him in his time. What was the broader philosophical scene like back then? He wasn't operating in a vacuum, surely.
No, definitely not. The Hellenistic period was complex, dynamic. Philosophy fragmented into various schools, sometimes contradictory, all vying for followers, for intellectual dominance.
A marketplace of ideas.
You could say that. Alexander's empire had shaken things up. Greek culture met new thought systems, deepening the fundamental debates. It was a rich tapestry, but also full of competing claims about truth, about the best way to live, especially in a world feeling more uncertain, more globalized.
So who were the main players besides Pyrrho?
Well, during this period, three main philosophical currents were really prominent. You had Stoicism.
Right, virtue, reason, living in harmony.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Aiming for inner fortitude, emotional control. Then Epicureanism.
Focused on pleasure through tranquility, freedom from fear.
Right. simple living, friendship, contemplation, and then academic skepticism, which actually came out of Plato's Academy. They also practiced a form of doubt, questioning certainty.
So similar to Pyrrhon.
Similar but crucially different. Within this vibrant, often contentious atmosphere, Pyrrhon carved out his own distinct and much more radical skeptical position, while Stoics and Epicureans offered their own dogmatic claims about reality and happiness.
Pyrrhon questioned the possibility of knowing those truths at all.
Precisely. That was his radical departure.
How did he stack up against the big names, Plato and Aristotle? We think of them as the foundation. Did they even engage with his ideas?
Well, Plato and Aristotle were earlier, representing the dogmatic thought Pyrrhon reacted against. Plato's world of ideas, Aristotle's comprehensive systems of logic and science, they were built on claims of definite knowledge, absolute truths. They believed they could grasp ultimate reality.
So Pyrrhon's skepticism wasn't just a different opinion.
No, it was a fundamental, foundational critique of their whole project. He didn't just tweak their ideas, he challenged the very premise of their intellectual ambition that definitive knowledge was even possible.
And his view was that seeking certainty actually caused problems.
Exactly. He thought definite knowledge claims were not only misleading, but actually created unnecessary mental contradictions, disturbances. The pursuit of certainty, for him, was a source of agitation, not liberation. Trying to find certainty in an uncertain world, you're destined for unhappiness, he'd argue.
That's powerful. But how did his skepticism compare to academic skepticism? That sounds similar coming from Plato's school. What made Pyrrhon so unique, so radical?
That's an excellent question, and it really highlights his radicalism. Pyrrhon's skepticism was far more absolute than academic skepticism.
How so?
While the academic skeptics, being closer to Plato's tradition, might accept some limited claims, maybe provisional truths for practical life, or probabilistic reasoning.
Kind of like, we can't know for sure, but this is probably the best bet.
Something like that. Pyrrhon, in stark contrast, advocated for an absolute, complete suspension of judgment epiche and a total rejection of certainty in all matters. Theoretical, metaphysical, practical, everything.
So the academics might say, stick to what's probable. But Pyrrhon said,
After applying isosphenia, he said, we can't know for sure, so let's suspend judgment entirely and find peace right there in that suspension. He took the skeptical premise to its absolute logical extreme.
and that made all the difference.
It really did. His thinking had a revolutionary impact then, and became a cornerstone for skepticism later on. He truly represents the most radical understanding of skepticism developed against dogmatism. He redefined the boundaries of what philosophy could be, and crucially, what its ultimate purpose should be.
Shifting from finding answers to questioning the possibility of answers.
Exactly, opening a new path for inquiry and for personal tranquility.
Okay, so given how mysterious his life was, and the fact he didn't write anything himself, which is amazing for such an influential philosopher,
Yeah.
how did his ideas even survive? How did they not just disappear?
That's a critical point for his legacy, yeah. No, Pyrrhon didn't write books. His philosophy was systematically compiled, articulated, documented much later, primarily by Sextus Empiricus,
Ah, Sextus Empiricus.
a physician and philosopher in the Roman period, maybe 2nd century CE. His compilation, especially the work Outlines of Pyrrhonism, was absolutely crucial. It transformed skepticism from Pyrrhon's individual, lived practice into a formalized philosophical school that could be studied, debated, passed down.
So Sextus Empiricus basically saved Pyrrhonism for us.
In a very real sense, yes. His works meticulously presented Pyrrhon's ideas, organized them, articulated the arguments for epike and isosthenia clearly, drawing on Pyrrhon's followers. This ensured the ideas reached future generations. Without him, our knowledge would be way more fragmented, his influence much less.
Did the influence stop after the Romans? Or did these ideas keep echoing through history, maybe in unexpected ways?
Oh, they definitely continued, and in fascinating ways. It shows the timeless appeal of radical doubt. During the Middle Ages, for example, in both Islamic and Christian philosophy, skepticism was a significant topic.
Really? How did that fit with faith?
Well, the idea of radical doubt, even indirectly, illuminated debates about the relationship between human reason and absolute faith. Thinkers like Al-Ghazali in the Islamic world, or later scholastics like Aquinas in the West, they grappled with the limits of reason versus divine revelation. Pyrrhon's emphasis on reason's limits provided a framework, sometimes as a challenge to overcome, for understanding faith's role.
Okay, that's interesting. But now, let's jump forward. I'm thinking closer to our time, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment. Did his ideas reach them? Did they shape our modern world?
Yes, absolutely. His legacy is particularly evident, profoundly influential in the Renaissance and modern periods. It shaped what we now call philosophical skepticism, and remarkably, even the scientific method.
Wow, the scientific method. How?
Well, first, thinkers like Montaigne in the French Renaissance were deeply influenced by Pyrrhonism, using it to challenge the dogmatic claims of his own time in religion, politics. Then you get giants like David Hume in the Scottish Enlightenment.
Hume's, right.
Hume integrated aspects of Pyrrhon's skeptical approach into epistemology. He fundamentally questioned the limits of human understanding, the nature of knowledge, especially things like causation and induction.
His famous argument about cause and effect.
Exactly.
Mhm.
That we can't definitively prove cause and effect, we only observe constant conjunction. That echoes Pyrrhonian suspension of judgment. We see one billiard ball hit another, the second moves. We assume causation. But Hume, channeling Pyrrhon, says we never actually perceive the causal link itself, just the events happening together. We're suspending judgment on the ultimate nature of cause.
That's fascinating. And the connection to science.
The very skeptical approach at the heart of the modern scientific method, questioning assumptions, demanding empirical evidence, constantly trying to falsify hypotheses, refusing to accept conclusions without rigorous testing.
That has its philosophical roots in Pyrrhon's ideas. That cautious, critical, self-correcting stance. Not taking things at face value, constantly looking for counter-evidence. It's a direct intellectual descendant of Isisthenia and Epoche.
Keeping an open mind until the evidence is overwhelming, and even then.
Remaining open to revision. Exactly.
So Pyrrhon's philosophy is really a precursor to so many modern discussions: epistemology, ethics, even psychology.
It truly is. His skepticism is valuable not just for questioning certainty in abstract debates, but for its profound implications for mental health, quality of life. In our age of information overload, anxiety, polarization, his ancient wisdom feels remarkably fresh, liberating, practical.
It's really amazing how a philosopher from so long ago, whose own words are lost, offers such relevant, practical insights for us today. He was clearly more than just a theorist. He offered a lived philosophy aimed at practical peace. Indeed. He's remembered not just as a developer of theories or a debater, but maybe most importantly as a profound guide to spiritual tranquility. His life and ideas showed philosophy could be deeply personal, transformative, offering liberation from the mental burdens of an unknowable world.
What an incredible deep dive into Pyrrhon of Elais. He really stands out, doesn't he? The earliest, most radical skeptic in ancient Greek philosophy, aiming for that unshakable tranquility, ataraxia, by consciously suspending claims of definite knowledge through Isisthenia and Epoche.
Yeah, his philosophy put epistemological doubt, especially recognizing the equal strength of arguments, right at the center of life. He turned philosophy from just an intellectual game into a kind of psychological therapy, an ethical guide.
That critical stance against the dogmatic search for knowledge, it left such a mark. Showing liberation from mental conflicts comes through suspending judgment, accepting uncertainty.
Exactly. He showed philosophy can be both a tool for understanding the world, even if that means understanding its unknowability, and a powerful means for profound spiritual serenity.
It's such a powerful and liberating message, especially for our anxious, opinion-saturated times.
It really is.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, here's something to think about. In a world that relentlessly demands certainty, immediate judgment, definitive answers on everything.
Everything from global events to what's for dinner, yeah.
Exactly. What might it truly mean for you to embrace the conscious uncertainty that Pyrrhon advocated? Could letting go of that desperate need for absolute truths, for definitive answers, actually be the most direct path to greater peace, mental freedom, and true ataraxia in your own life?
It's definitely a thought worth sitting with.
Perhaps even suspending judgment on for a while.